8 feet beneath your home, something extraordinary is happening right now. It is something so simple and yet so powerful. It has quietly existed for thousands of years without most people ever realizing it. While the air above you constantly shifts between heat waves and freezing temperatures, the ground below remains almost completely unchanged. It holds a steady temperature that does not rise, does not fall, and does not react to the chaos above the surface. And what makes this even more fascinating is that this stable temperature is not random, nor is it a coincidence. It is the result of a natural process that turns the Earth itself into a thermal battery, one that absorbs heat slowly, stores it over time, and releases it so gradually that it creates a permanent zone of stability just a few meters below your feet. Once you go deep enough, roughly 2 meters beneath the surface, the daily and even seasonal temperature fluctuations simply disappear, replaced by a constant baseline that reflects the average annual temperature of that region. That means that in many parts of the world, the ground quietly maintains a temperature somewhere between 10 and 15 degrees Celsius, regardless of whether it is snowing above or the sun is burning everything in sight. And this is where things start to become difficult to ignore. What modern homes spend enormous amounts of energy trying to achieve with air conditioning systems, heating units, and complex climate control technologies, the Earth is already doing for free, continuously, silently, and with perfect consistency. But this is not a new discovery. In fact, what is far more surprising is that ancient civilizations not only understood this, but actively built entire systems around it. They designed cities, homes, and infrastructure in ways that allowed them to tap directly into this natural stability, long before electricity, long before modern engineering, and long before anyone ever imagined a world dependent on mechanical cooling. In ancient Persia, engineers built vast underground tunnel systems called qanats. They were designed to transport water long distances beneath the desert, but they also had a secondary and equally important effect. As air passed through those tunnels, it lost heat to the surrounding Earth and emerged at the surface much cooler than the scorching air above. When these systems were combined with wind catchers, structures that captured airflow and directed it downward into buildings, something remarkable happened. Hot desert air was pulled through underground channels, cooled naturally by the Earth, and then released into living spaces, creating an environment that remained comfortable even when outside temperatures exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. Perhaps even more astonishing, some of these systems could preserve ice through the entire summer in the middle of the desert without any refrigeration. They relied entirely on passive cooling, insulation, and the stable temperature of the ground below. At the same time, in completely different parts of the world, similar ideas were emerging independently. That suggests this was not a rare or isolated innovation, but a natural conclusion that humans arrived at once they began to understand how the environment around them behaved. Because the Romans, for example, incorporated underground air channels into their villas, they allowed cool air to pass through shaded, earth-cooled corridors before entering living spaces, effectively reducing indoor temperatures without any mechanical assistance. In Korea, traditional architecture used underfloor heating and cooling systems that leveraged the thermal properties of the ground to maintain comfort throughout the year. In the American Southwest, indigenous communities built partially underground homes, using the surrounding earth as insulation. That protected inhabitants from extreme heat during the day and from cold at night, creating stable living conditions in environments that would otherwise be hostile. So when you look at all of these systems together, across continents, cultures, and time periods, a pattern begins to emerge. These civilizations were not relying on technology in the modern sense, but rather on observation and on working with natural systems, instead of trying to overpower them. Which leads to a question that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. If this worked so well, why did we stop using it? Because the answer is not that these systems failed, and it is not that they became obsolete. Rather, They were gradually replaced by something else, something that offered more control, more scalability, and perhaps most importantly, more profit. Because in the early 20th century, the invention of modern air conditioning changed everything. It began with systems designed to control humidity in industrial environments, but it quickly evolved into a technology that could regulate temperature in homes, offices, and entire cities. And as this technology spread, it did not simply offer an alternative, it redefined expectations, because comfort was no longer something that depended on design, location, or environmental understanding, but something that could be achieved instantly, at the push of a button. And over time, this shift began to reshape architecture itself, as buildings were no longer designed to work with natural airflow, natural shading, or the thermal properties of the ground, but instead became sealed environments, entirely dependent on mechanical systems to maintain livable conditions. And as this happened, the older knowledge did not disappear overnight, but it slowly faded, becoming less common, less taught, and eventually almost completely forgotten in many parts of the world. But the physics never changed, because the ground beneath us is still there, still stable, still maintaining that constant temperature, regardless of how we choose to build above it. And in some regions, that knowledge was never lost, because in parts of Europe, particularly in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, systems known as earth tubes are still being used today. These systems move air through pipes buried underground so the air can exchange heat with the surrounding soil before it enters a building. The results are not theoretical, they are measurable. In summer, hot air entering these systems is cooled significantly before it reaches indoor spaces. In winter, cold air is warmed by the ground, reducing the energy required for heating. Over time, this leads to substantial energy savings, often reducing the need for traditional heating and cooling systems by a significant margin. But like any system, the effectiveness depends on how it is designed, because depth matters. Too shallow, and the ground temperature fluctuates with the weather. Too deep, and installation becomes impractical. AR flow must be carefully controlled, because if the air moves too quickly, it does not have enough time to exchange heat, and if it moves too slowly, the system becomes inefficient. Then there is moisture. As warm air cools underground, condensation forms, and if that moisture is not properly managed, it can lead to problems such as mold or reduced air quality. So while the concept itself is simple, the execution requires precision, planning, and an understanding of how these elements interact. But once everything is aligned, something subtle begins to happen, because instead of fighting against the environment, the system begins to work with it, smoothing out temperature extremes, reducing fluctuations, and creating a space that feels more stable, more balanced, and more consistent over time. And perhaps that is why this approach is so often overlooked, because it does not feel dramatic, it does not produce instant, noticeable changes, it does not rely on visible machinery or constant noise. It simply works, quietly, consistently, in the background. Which brings us back to the same question. If this has always worked, if it still works today, and if the solution is literally beneath our feet, then why is it not everywhere? Because the answer is not found in science. It is found in systems. Economic systems that prioritize certain solutions over others. Educational systems that determine what is taught and what is ignored. And regulatory systems that define what is considered standard practice. And once those systems are established, anything outside of them becomes invisible. Not because it does not exist, but because it is no longer recognized. But the ground does not follow those systems. It does not respond to trends, markets, or technology. It responds only to physics. And that physics has remained unchanged for thousands of years, which means that beneath every home, beneath every city, beneath every place we have built, there is still a stable, constant environment waiting to be used. Not as a new discovery, but as something we once understood, and may be starting to understand again.